Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rebecca Hogue, and I am a Scottish and Irish settler raised in Kanaka Maoli lands in the Ahupua of Ko'olapoko on the island of Oahu in the Pai'aina of Hawaii. And I am a scholar of Pacific literatures. Here at Harvard, I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Mahindra Humanities Center. And it is my great honor to welcome you to tonight's event and to introduce Professor Daniel Heath Justice. We are gathered here this evening in native space. Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. As Massachusetts Elder Elizabeth Solomon reminded us last week at President Gay's inauguration, quote, "Speaking words of honor and acknowledgement are of particular importance here at Harvard." It was in native space that Harvard University began its long history, and it was in native space that the university was able to survive and grow. Harvard's founding charter committed to educate English and Indian youth, and both studied here, end quote. But as we know, these promises and commitments to Indigenous knowledges have not always been prioritized by this institution and have often been actively suppressed. It is Harvard's responsibility to, and each of ours who participate in it, to continue to renew these commitments to Indigenous students, faculty, and staff, and make sure that Indigenous studies at Harvard can thrive and grow and grow. For the past several years at Harvard, I have had the great privilege of teaching with Professor Justice's book, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter. Students from all over the world are moved by his clarity, his provocations, and his poignancy. His discussions of the multitude of Indigenous storytelling, political, and generic forms challenge students to sit in the nuances and the transformative possibilities of imagining otherwise. Every year, I have students ask me where they can find more of Professor Justice's writing. And fortunately for all of us, there is so much to choose from. Professor Justice's work in Indigenous literary studies takes up questions and issues of kinship, belonging, sexuality, personhood, and nationhood, and with increasing attention to the intersections between Indigenous literatures, speculative fiction, and other than human peoples. He comes to Massachusetts territory to join the Department of English as a Harvard College visiting professor in ethnicity, indigeneity, and migration for this academic year. Professor Daniel Heath Justice is a queer Colorado-born citizen of the Cherokee Nation, a Spears, Foreman, Riley, and Shields citizen descendant through his father, and of mixed Euro-American settler heritage through his mother. He is professor of critical Indigenous studies and English and a distinguished university scholar at the University of British Columbia, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and an officer of the Order of Canada. His published work includes the literary studies, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, and as well as Our Fire Survives the Storm, a Cherokee literary history, the animal cultural histories, Raccoon and Badger, the Indigenous epic fantasy, The Way of Thorn and Thunder, and various edited and co-edited works, including the Oxford Handbook of Indigenous American Literature with James H. Cox, and Allotment Stories, Indigenous Land Relations Under Settler Siege with Jean M. O'Brien. We are so lucky to share space with you today. At the end of Professor Justice's talk, he will be taking questions. And we will be using the Q&A format proposed by Ununga scholar Eve Tuck, which you will find described in detail on the handouts that are on your seat. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Daniel Heath Justice.
Wado. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Yeah, a lot of you snuck in while I was sitting there. Good to see you. Thank you. It's important for me. I'm a language learner, a late language learner, but I think especially in places like this, it's important for Cherokee language to be heard. So if there are any Cherokee language speakers in here, apologies for pronunciation, but I do want to also give my acknowledgements in Cherokee. Osio Gnali, Aju Jalagihi Ayatel Jalagi Gundi, Daniel Justice, Dagwado, Nagu, Jigi, Hulhuai, Half Moon Bay, BC, Shishal Swaya, Janela Aseno, Victor, Colorado, Ute Ayatel, Digagai, Gali Aliga, Massachusetts, Ayatel, Jigado, Wado. So I want to thank the Mahindra Humanities Center, including Stephen Beal, Mary McKinnon, and Julia Corso, Robin Winge for the stunning poster design, the staff at HUNAP, especially Kaylee Bennett, and the Department of English for sponsoring and organizing this event and hosting me this year, and Rebecca for the introduction and for moderating the Q&A. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. All right. Thank you for having me. So these are just going to keep cycling through. They aren't connected to any particular moment, but I did want to make sure that you have the opportunity to see and take notes about some of these fantastic Indigiqueer writers and scholars. So we begin. What if, instead of the ever-widening ruptures of apocalyptic ending, we dream into being better beginning? What if, instead of seeing the world as a dumpster fire and standing by to drink coffee and watch it burn, we understood the world as a wounded relative, who it's our obligation to bring to wholeness? The worlds that emerge from each of these tellings determine not only what we think of the future, but of the present and past as well. But only one has room for us in all our diversity and beauty. In reflecting on Indigiqueer imaginings and my own journey through these otherwise worlds, it doesn't escape me that this moment, in this place, was far beyond the imaginative horizons of the queer mixed blood kid who grew up in the little mining town of Victor, Colorado. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that it's been the work of my fellow Indigiqueer writers that has most powerfully expanded those horizons and made clear that I could abide in the both and of Indigiqueer personhood and not the impoverished and dismembering either or of the settler imaginary. So I dedicate these words to their generous and generative community with profound and lasting gratitude. Rupture and restoration. These are things that Indigenous peoples know well. As Grovon literature and law scholar Sydnor Larson wrote in 2000, quote, "American Indian people have recently experienced the end of the world. We are a post-apocalypse people who, as such, have tremendous experience to offer all other people who experience their own cultural death as part of the natural cycle. The ways in which American Indian people have suffered, survived, and managed to go on, communicated through storytelling, have tremendous potential to affect the future of all mankind." End quote. Now, I would dispute the natural cycle part, but we'll put that to the side. When many people talk about the ending of worlds, they too often forget that for Indigenous peoples, the ending is only part of the story, though you wouldn't know that from stereotypes. The beginning of new worlds is also part of our reality. Not all those new worlds are better, mind you. Some are decidedly worse. But endings are rarely final. Those new worlds are imagined and storied into being long before they're realized, and that's part of the work we're called to do. To speak our own stories and those of our nations into the world and make manifest as best we can our rightful place in the world making to come. This is where I want to center my words tonight. I want to talk together about the end and beginning of worlds and the role of Indigiqueer writers and artists in bringing them into being, for we are connected by an otherwise genealogy that has long worked toward meaningful Indigenous worlds beyond the sufferings of the now. So here, Indigiqueer as both a term and as a futurist concept come from the work of Oji-nêhiyaw writer, scholar, and visionary Joshua Whitehead, who you've seen pop up a time or two, who employs it in tandem with the more widely used cultural and political term of two-spirit. As he explains, quote, "I use two-spirit because it's a homecoming and a home calling. For me, to take the word Indigenous and braid it with queer is a new type of worlding. A braiding of two bridges. I really like the biting edge Indigiqueer has. I think of it as the driving force that is pulling along two-spiritedness," end quote. Further, in a recent dialogue with Angie Abdu, aptly titled Indigiqueer, a conversation about storytelling, Whitehead expands on the political implications of this term. Quote, "To animate two-spirit like a necromancer is to fit cleanly and neatly in the present, is a violent reanimating of our ancestors. The language, though, not so much, because language never dies. But a body does, a human does. We can reanimate the language, bring it back, but it can't be preserved in temporal amber. It needs to mutate and change. Hence, Indigiqueer. Hence, not knowing and knowing. That's the whole damn point to me. That's the whole futuristic key of Indigenous sexual and, by relation, environmental sovereignty, because to be undefinable is to be unknowable to colonial powers. That's radical freedom," end quote. The nuance here is important. In my reading, this undefinability isn't to be wholly unknowable. It's to be unknowable specifically to colonial powers, which prioritize easily weaponized stereotypes over uncontainable complexities. Indigiqueer isn't just an articulation of individual vision and experience, but of complex, multifaceted, collective purpose and continuity. And not only for those of now, but for ancestors past and future. It thus stands outside the reach of queer settler claims to Indigenous history, as if we've only ever existed for their narratives of belonging. And, as Dene theorist Lou Cornum reminds us, quote, "Indigenous futurism is centered on bringing traditions to distant future locations rather than abandoning them as relics. Indigenous futurism does not care for speed so much as sustainability, not so much for progress as balance, and not power, but relation," end quote. We make a grave mistake in thinking of genealogies as being temporally fixed in the past, or to a model of progressive linearity. Genealogy is about relation more than time. The fossilized past is where colonialism would consign all Indigenous peoples, with Indigiqueer people absent even from that memory. Our work is to remember what has been dismembered across time and space. Indigiqueer genealogies stretch across those ruptures, and in contrast to those of settler colonial imaginaries, are at least as concerned with futurity as they are with history, if not more so. The literary genealogy of Indigiqueer imagining is futurist in orientation. Insisting on Indigiqueer people in the future is a radically transformative act of storied embodiment. And bodies matter here, as Dene poet Jake Skeets writes so movingly. Quote, "Our bodies are our future. Our landscapes are our future. So if we return to the manifesto of an anti-colonial future, we can also employ an anti-colonial hope. One that doesn't rely on linearity, but that is deeply intimate from the deep space and time of the self. One that is birthed from the deepest parts of our bodies and times. For me, the best way to achieve this is through storytelling and language. Storytelling has the ability to conjure the deepest parts of ourselves and reimagine time, and thus reimagine hope. Storytelling allows us to embrace what is far away, remember what was forgotten, and hope for a future existing now. A future existing now. I love these words. They ground Indigiqueer life and love. Indigiqueer worlding and world-making strive beyond the tragedies and the traumas of the fixed past and are thus essential to any truly transformative decolonial politic. There can be no meaningful Indigenous sovereignty, no restoration of healthy land, waters, languages, or culture, no lasting healing of bodies, minds, spirits, and families and selves without Indigiqueer visionaries or Indigiqueer futurity as part of that vital work. Mississauga Anishinaabe writer and theorist Leanne Takamasuk Simpson observes, quote, "Queer bodies are political orders. Queer Indigenous bodies are political orders. Queer Indigenous bodies house knowledge, relationships, and responsibilities. Queer Indigenous bodies are a threat to settler sovereignty, which is why queer indigeneity has been and is violently targeted by colonial and settler colonial powers in an ongoing way in order to dispossess. Queer Indigenous bodies therefore also house and generate a wealth of theory and critical analysis regarding settler colonialism that straight bodies cannot. Engaging in anti-queerness, therefore, in all its various manifestations is tantamount, in my mind, to us consenting to and participating in autogenocide." And this comes from a discussion where she is advocating for the importance of grounding political action within queer Indigenous experience and relationships. We're of course not simply talking about bodies, but bodies in relationship. We're talking too about peoplehood. On the point of futurity, just as colonial gender binaries are insufficient for meaningful Indigiqueer expression, so too, I would argue, is genre. And I want to make clear, I'm not anti-genre, but I do think it's limited. Indigenous writers are often pushing against the limits of form, but Indigiqueer visionaries do so with particular urgency. In Writing as a Rupture, from his extraordinary recent collection, Making Love with the Land, Whitehead argues that, quote, "Indigenous storytelling deploys all genres and no genres simultaneously, as it envelops past, present, and future seamlessly. How can our stories become literature, assuming we even want this, under the colonial, classed, and heteropatriarchal gatekeeping of form and genre?" End quote. The book is, in effect, what he elsewhere calls a howl at the gate of these partisans, and it challenges constrictions of memoir, essay, prayer, love song, cry of anguish, in articulating one embodied Indigiqueer experience within the thingifying limitations of English. Whitehead's howl is in a kind of trans-temporal chorus with Bay of Quinte Mohawk writer, community builder, and now ancestor, Beth Brant, who articulated a similar struggle throughout her wide-ranging corpus, but nowhere more reflectively than in her 1994 essay, Writing Life. She offers this still timely observation. Quote, "I do not believe that all writing is autobiographical, or that a writer has to use words as a confessional. In fact, I think that type of writing is unique to white North America. I do know that as a Mohawk woman, I was born and grew up in a culture that persists and resists, but also carries its load of colonial untruths. As an Aboriginal Indigenous woman, I have internalized these untruths. Writing helps me to let go. The spirits of writing bring comfort, assurance, righteous anger, deliverance. Writing is the place to feel all senses commingle and cohabit, bringing forth something new, giving birth to words, to beings that will inhabit story, that are story. This is what the spirits bring: verdant sensuality, lush panoply, a garden, end quote. Brant is not metaphorizing spirits here. These are beings of generative significance in her understanding of writing, just as they are in Whitehead's work, when he asks, quote, "What does realism mean to indigenous literatures when what it wholly regards as real, dreams, tricksters, ancestors, visions, anthropomorphism, little people, star people, wendigo, is disregarded as speculative or fantastical by other readers, publishers, and academia?" End quote. For Brant, Whitehead, and other Indigiqueer writers, the taxonomies of genre constrain imaginations and spirits and bodies in relation, impinging on the desire that animates those relations and the worlds that result. Desire bleeds beyond colonial categories and bridges the ruptures in our histories, identities, and experiences. Such embodiment is vital to Indigiqueer arts, in part because Indigiqueer bodies, as Simpson pointed out, have so long been the site of colonial violence and dispossession. Physically, certainly, but at least as devastatingly ideologically and spiritually. At least since Balboa's enthusiastic slaughter of around 40, quote, young men in women's apparel with warhounds in 1513, Indigiqueer embodiment has been perceived as both target and threat. Bodies that aren't supposed to exist also aren't supposed to experience pleasure. Pleasure confirms worthiness and defies shame and control, and colonial agents have expended enormous energy in either erasing Indigiqueer bodies entirely or making embodiment painful rather than pleasure. And educators are also among those colonial agents. Indigiqueer imaginings refuse those erasures, and because of that, they insist on the transformative power of pleasure, the messy necessity of consent in and across our diverse bodies in all their complexities, the constitutive nature of desire, the elemental erotic kinship between and among humans and between us and other than human beings, whether that is sexual or different kinds of intimacy. But Indigiqueer imaginings are also about enlivening and enhancing various forms of kinship with other human beings, and to see relatedness not only in shared experience, but in shared and separate struggle. As targets of intersecting colonial violences, Indigiqueer writers have long been concerned with liberation beyond the singularities of oppression, and this has only become more urgent over time. As Driftpile Cree poet and scholar Billy Ray Belcourt notes, quote, "Our freedoms are bound up in one another," end quote. A gesture to Black cultural theorist Fred Moten's reminder that, quote, "We are sent by one another to one another," end quote. Belcourt continues, quote, "My reading of Christina Sharp sent me to Dion Brand and Saidiya Hartman. My reading of Moten sent me to the Afro-pessimists. Tiffany Lathabo King sent me back to Audre Lorde. Lorde reminded me of the revolutionary desire that brought me to poetry in the first place." With kinship as the constitutive ethic, Indigiqueer worldings can't ever be only about imagining Indigenous freedoms in isolation, but in working toward the shared liberation of all, and challenging not only the anti-Blackness in society at large, but in our own communities, families, and selves, too. So thus far, I've been speaking of broad principles and contexts, but I think it's also important to ground these in the particularities of lived experience. As I'm also part of this genealogy of Indigiqueer worlding, and I've been fortunate to participate in these conversations as they've changed and expanded over my career. In many ways, the anti-trans and anti-queer venom of the moment feels very familiar. Though I'm a very different person now than I was in the late 90s when I started coming out and started to embrace my Cherokee kin and heritage more intentionally and with less shame. That fearful familiarity has put me in a bit of a reflective mode these days, but not one that lingers in fear. Instead, what I feel is great hope that the toxic neo-Puritan rage we're facing now is the collapse of a failing order, that if we're courageous and determined, will make room for something better. I came out to myself on the day of Matthew Shepard's funeral. I was driving from Colorado back to the University of Nebraska and listening to news coverage of the church protest of his family and mourners. And I realized with utter clarity that the closet wouldn't save me. Death was the only future these people wanted for us. And even then, they'd continue to torment and harass us. So knowing that, why not come out? Why not live and love and find joy and pleasure as best I could? The world I'd known had been broken apart, but I couldn't see a way of fitting those jagged pieces back together, or even if I wanted to. It would still be a while before I came out to others, but in the meantime, there was work to do. It was not a great time to be out in Lincoln, Nebraska. AIDS was omnipresent and a deadly menace in our imaginations and in a lot of people's lives. Virulent anti-gay politics were the order of the day, especially with the repelling anti-same-sex marriage constitutional amendment 416. And Lincoln was a dangerous place to be gay. But it was no place of respite for Indigenous people either. One night, after having dinner with a friend, I was attacked by a young white man who jumped out of a truck to scream homophobic taunts. When I turned away, he hit me in the back of the head and knocked me to the ground, then joined his laughing buddies as their truck tore down the street. I wasn't badly hurt, quite shaken, but later I told my friend that I was surprised they were so brazen in going after me with her standing right there and right on a busy downtown city street where no one offered to help us. She was an older Seminole woman, far more phenotypically native than me, and she gave me a patient but knowing look and said, "Daniel, my presence has never stopped an act of violence." The chilling and heavy weight of those quiet words have never left me. But neither has the memory of us picking ourselves up and moving on and continuing with our friendship and our lives and our work, regardless of what those loud-mouthed shitheads in the pickup had to say about it. It was actually pretty good training for an academic career. Even though there was a substantial Native population in Nebraska, Indigenous issues were erased entirely from the state's cultural consciousness, except as historical footnotes or racist mascots or debates on tribal casinos or liquor stores in reservation border towns. And in Lincoln, I experienced far more racism in the largely white queer community than homophobia in the Native community. I'd really only just started to comprehend who I was as a Cherokee citizen raised far from our kin and well beyond our cultural crucible in Northeast Oklahoma. I knew I was queer, but I couldn't imagine how that could fit with my Cherokee-ness. I only knew that one made me despised, the other made me an anachronism. It was Indigiqueer ancestors Beth Brant and Lynn Riggs who showed me a way forward in dignity well before I had mentors in person. They were the iridescent flash I followed back to self. Brant was a working-class two-spirit lesbian, a mother and grandmother and lover and fierce advocate for Indigenous writing and desire and the complexities of Indigenous life. She was the first Indigiqueer writer I ever read, and I was astonished. Here was a formidable woman, an eloquent storyteller who refused to accept the either-or of the settler imaginary. She insisted on the both and, even in the face of violent homophobia, misogyny, and racism. Her work spoke to my time and place in an almost fated way. I found her 1994 book, Writing as Witness, Essay and Talk, in a used bookstore just off campus in Lincoln, and it became a kind of protective and aspirational talisman. I still have that copy of the book. It, along with her other works and two of her storied concepts, Presenting Ourselves and Writing as Witness, continue to inform my understanding of Indigenous literary expression. The first is her alternative to the concept of coming out, which she felt was too deeply enmeshed enmeshed in individualistic white notions of identity formation. Rather than coming out away from our communities, Brant suggested that we present ourselves to our kin, to our communities, however those were understood, in all our truth and complexity and courage, as a way of honoring meaningful kinship ties. It's an incorporative mode, not an oppositional one. And she didn't necessarily assume that presenting yourself necessarily meant your community was ready to accept you. But the act of the presentation was about reconnection, not separation. The second concept, writing as witness, affirms the power of writing, however that's understood, to bear witness to the diversity and complexities of Indigenous experience beyond colonial stereotypes. But witness here isn't just about observation. It gestures to widespread Indigenous practices wherein witnesses are called upon to publicly recall in a communal space and thus embody the shared truth of events, and by doing so, return them to the community's collective understanding. It places the entire community into deeper shared and storied accountability, an ethos of meaningful reciprocity that, in its literary expression, inherently challenges the idea of singular authorial genius. Lynn Riggs was a gay Cherokee playwright, screenwriter, and poet born before Oklahoma statehood in Kuskokwim district of the Cherokee Nation, not far from where my grandmother was born. His greatest claim to fame was his play Green Grow the Lilacs, better known in the Rodgers and Hammerstein adaptation of Oklahoma. Although he was a prolific and well-regarded writer throughout his life who took up many controversial issues, though notably, explicit queerness was not among them. And he took up some wild stuff. So anyway, Riggs was deeply rooted in the lands of his birth, and his work demonstrates a profound understanding of place and the complex and often violent layers of history and identity there. He had never fully presented himself in quite the way Brant advocated, but he nevertheless lived a nearly open and apparently very sexually adventurous life in spite of the violent homophobia of the first half of the 20th century. For me, it was less about whether or not he was recognizably out than the fact that he existed. That alone was enough to know that my queerness could exist alongside and even as part of my Cherokeeness. I would fortunately come to know other queer Cherokees, some of whom were much more rooted in culture, language, and grounded kinship. But in that time and place, Riggs was a lifeline to both the past and the future. Excuse me for just a sec. So here's where my genealogy begins to get muddled. Who's next? Should I have put Concow poet Janice Gould first, as she was the first queer Native person I actually met when I was an undergraduate, still firmly in the closet, and I drove her around the University of Northern Colorado in my beat-up old Chevy. We would later become friends, and she would go on to teach just an hour from my hometown. But in truth, I came to Brant's writing first and only appreciated Gould's remarkable poetry later. What about Laguna Pueblo and Sioux writer Paula Gunn Allen, whose flawed but powerful work prompted so many important conversations about gender and sexuality in Native communities and across racialized communities? Or Menominee poet Christos, who so boldly braided pleasure, pain, and politics. It was queer and two-spirit women writers who showed so many of us that there were worlds of dignified Indigenous experience beyond the ruptures of history, territory, and experience. They would be followed in my reading by Gregory Schofield, Greg Saris, and especially Craig Womack, whose novel Drowning in Fire would chronicle the love story of two gay Muskogee Creek boys in contemporary Oklahoma, suturing shut a wound I didn't realize was open. Home place as queer placing. I needed that more than I could articulate. And where do I go from there? After all, it's not as if my learning ended with those of my generation and earlier. In the 22 years since Drowning in Fire was published, which kind of horrified me when I realized that yesterday, I've been inspired, challenged, and transformed by so many Indigiqueer writers, and I continue to be so. The emergent voices are every bit as profound as the older and ancestral ones, and so many are asking questions and pushing boundaries far beyond anything we of my generation dared. Indeed, we are in a remarkable time of Indigiqueer literary production. I'd go so far as to say that Indigiqueer writers are at the imaginative forefront of the field today, shaking up our expectations of what the literary is and can be. Even so, this insistence can reveal other kinds of woundings. The first time I taught a two-spirit literature course when I was a young professor at the University of Toronto, we were nearly at the end of the semester when a student asked, "Considering how much the writers discuss it, why don't we ever talk about sex in this class?" I was quite taken aback, not by the question, but by the fact that we hadn't done so. I realized that deep down, I was still afraid. Here I was publishing and teaching about Indigenous sexuality. I was fully out. I was married to my husband. I was ostensibly presenting myself to the world in all the fullness of my proud queerness, teaching works that took sex and embodied pleasure as vital concerns, and yet I'd internalized so much shame that even in a class about Indigenous queerness, I'd never been able to explicitly talk about it. While so much of my own critical and creative genealogy is rooted in the courageous creativity of those who came before, it's been the younger writers and scholars like Whitehead, Skeets, Belcourt, Cornum, Ariel Twist, Joseph Pierce, Smokey Sumac, Tommy Pico, Darcy Littlebadger, and so many others whose unabashed boldness and refusal to be shamed into silence about who they are as Indigiqueer people, who rightly insist on their place of dignified representation and meaningful participation in these emergent Indigiqueer worlds, have strengthened my own courage far beyond anything I could have imagined in my first fumbling understandings as I came out. I may be older than any of them, but here they are undoubtedly my elders in wisdom, and I'm grateful for it. A few years back, I published a short story called The Boys Who Became the Hummingbirds. I won't tell the whole thing here, as it's a bit too long for the time we have remaining, and I know that we want some time to chat. But I'll offer a bit of it by way of providing a glimpse of my own otherwise vision. It begins in a dying town where beauty went to die, and a strange and lonely boy who seeks to restore beauty to his community in spite of their hostility. He dances, they drive him away. He sings, they shout him down. He paints his clothes bright colors, they smear him with filth and tear his clothes to rags. He's visited in the darkness by other strange boys, but they always leave before dawn. Eventually, the community's hate overwhelms his strength, and they strip him, beat him, and drive him into exile. Strange Boy collapses in his hidden hovel, finally broken, when one of his shadow lovers comes openly to him and begins cleaning his wounds. They start to speak of their shared fear and shame, but also of their desire. And as fear recedes, beauty and passion return, and they are transformed. Strange Boy reached out, and this time, Shadow Boy did not pull back. He met Strange Boy's touch, and they embraced. And in the flowering of this loving moment, their bodies began to change. Scarred skin became bright feather, brown eyes darkened black, sable hair brightened to iridescent green and scarlet and turquoise. Now they rose up into the air and danced, together and apart, then together again, flashing through the air with dazzling color and the whir of beating wings. They danced until they were exhausted, found sweet sustenance in the bright, fierce flowers that still endured in hidden places, then danced again. The loneliness that Strange Boy had known was now gone. The solitude that Shadow Boy had long reconciled himself to was now memory. They were two and one at once. Beauty has transformed them in their world, and for a while, the two of them are enough. But something calls to them from the place they'd once called home, and they fly back to make a startling discovery. In their new bodies, with eyes unveiled by fear or hate, they could see the very hearts of the people. And to their amazement and joy, in every direction they looked, there were hummingbirds. Jeweled feathers of every hue shone like multicolored flames through shamed flesh and unyielding bone. And the sound they heard was a chorus of captive hearts. So many luminous hearts beat like frantic wings, desperate for release but held fast by self-loathing and the fear of judgment. The hummingbird boys realized at last that they had never been alone. They were just the first to free their hearts and fly in their own beauty. So they darted to those whose hearts beat strongest, streaks of blinding bright grace, calling to them in soft voices, sharing stories of possibility beyond the grim dust of what was to a hopeful possibility of what could be. And some of their kindred responded to the long-awaited call, body changing to echo spirit, becoming more than themselves than they had dared imagine, rising up and out of shame to join the hummingbird boys, streaks of rainbow difference that lit the darkening sky. These things that they had once been taught to hate of themselves, their gestures, their voices, their sizes, shades, strength, age, even the facets of their most tender flesh, all were part of their own distinct beauty, made more lovely because it was shared with such generous delight. Together they danced in unexpected belonging, and joyful tears fell to parched earth. As might be expected, not all the people had humming hearts. Some had hearts of harder, colder stuff. And some heard the call, felt their heart leap in response, and were so filled with dread of discovery that they gathered sharp rocks and flung them into the sky, seeking to destroy in others what they could not bear in themselves. But most of the freed spirits refused to be trapped again in a world empty of beauty. Now that they knew who they were and what they could be, together they turned back, their own voices loud, their shimmering plumage a beacon to those yet seeking release. Like iridescent lightning, the hummingbird boys led the way among their earthbound attackers, and where spearing beak and soft wings struck flesh, bright flowers bloomed. Rocks in clenched hands dissolved to glittering stardust, and soon the air thundered with the defiant song of 1,000 bright hummingbirds, and the world came alive again in a loving beauty too long denied. This is, for me, one vision of what Indigiqueer worlding offers to us. A world where, whenever someone heard the thrilling hum of soft wings in their breast, no matter how it came to be realized, no matter whether the quickening spirit was young or old, of all genders or none, the people now gathered in love and welcome. For they understood once again, as they had long ago, that no one was expendable. No one was forgotten. No one's beauty would ever again be shamed. These are the otherwise worlds that Indigiqueer artists and visionaries are imagining and loving into being, in spite of all the neo-puritanical violence of our cruel, incurious time. We must think about beginnings, not only of endings. We must attend to genealogies that reach forward, not only backward, and how these visions of otherwise possibility might strengthen all of us seeking something more than the brutalities of the present. And while there is much that fills me with dread in this hurtful and hateful time, if there's one unshakable truth to be found in Indigiqueer imaginings, it's this: you can't cage our hummingbird hearts. We'll fly in spite of it all, and we'll do it together. And that strengthens me for the work yet to come. Wadu, thank you. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to invite all of us in the audience to look at the guidelines of the Q&A if you haven't already. And in that, I'd love for you to have the opportunity for the next 5 to 8 minutes of communicating with one another and getting the chance to share some of your experiences of listening to Dr. Justice. What did you learn? What questions did you have? Discussing the questions you have, and then we will invite you all to ask questions of Dr. Justice. But let's go ahead and have 5 minutes of talking with one another to start.
And nobody's so rich they can't make new friends, so.
Okay. Thank you so much. It sounds like we were having some really excellent conversations. We'd like to invite you now to ask questions of Dr. Justice.
And please use the mic because it's being recorded, so. You're also talkative 2 minutes ago. Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you so much for this inspiring and really moving talk. I'm curious if you have insight into something that I'm really fascinated in, which is the kind of mode and genre of climate fiction that's imagining hopeful futures despite or amid climate change. I feel like you have so much to say about this, and this is a topic I'm really passionate about. And maybe you have things to say about collaborations between Indigiqueer, post-apocalyptic imaginaries, and this kind of general zeitgeist that's happening right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of Indigenous writers are responding to that call right now, not just Indigiqueer writers, and making strong connections between other kinds of colonial traumas. And one example that comes to mind is The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Dimaline, which is very much connected to climate catastrophe as well as the residential school, the history of residential schools in Canada. It's hard not to see the connections, right? And especially so many of our languages are embedded in landscapes that are besieged. I live on the west coast of British Columbia. Cedars are deeply significant to coastal communities, and in another 2 generations, we may not have any of those big cedars left because we've had droughts and droughts and droughts and droughts. I mean, it's been really, and the wildfires are horrific in that region. So I think in terms of Indigiqueer writers, I mean, I think Joshua Whitehead references this a lot in his work, and he has oops, sorry, I'm getting some feedback. He has an edited collection called Love Beyond the End. I think it's up here somewhere, yeah. Which is a collection of queer Indigenous writers kind of writing back to the apocalypse, and a lot of these have to do with climate change. So it's an urgent issue because it's impacting Indigenous peoples in particularly heinous ways. We can see that in Hawaii, right? And the horrific wildfire there. Indigenous peoples are on the front lines of climate catastrophe and are not buffered by a lot of the economic privileges that others are. So I think we're just going to see more of that work, but it's certainly something that writers are taking up. Wabgishig Rice has a novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow. Is that the first one? And there's a second one that just came out and also deals with climate change and the apocalypse. Both of these are Canadian based writers as well. I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. I was just reflecting on the feeling that this was not, that there was a kind of worlding that happened in this space, such that this was not what I have come to expect an academic talk to be in certain ways. Like I felt very present and connected and moved in ways that I don't necessarily anticipate. And so thank you for that. And I'm sort of just processing it, but also just wondering how, if you could speak to your experience within academia as someone, like you were saying, being interested in these works of like, I guess you didn't maybe use the word erotics, but like thinking about pleasure and positivity in a context where there's so much energy put into criticism, and just what that's been like for you.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, if you read the description that I wrote for the talk, it was pretty bad. I was rereading. I was like, how in the hell am I supposed to write this? And I wrote it, right? It was very. I kind of had this insecurity of like, well, this has to be a Harvard talk, and it was so stilted and it was so ponderous, and it didn't go where I needed it to. And so when I started writing, I really struggled, and I was talking with a good friend of mine who kind of reminded me that I'm a storyteller, and so I had forgotten story, right? And this is just the context that we're in, not just here, but in the academy, that there are all kinds of things that impinge on our ability to be fully present and to be vulnerable. It helps that I'm a visiting professor, right? Like if I screw this up, I'm out of here, right? And I'm loving it. I'm having a good time. I'm not trying to screw it up. I will be clear about that. But I think there's also a bit of freedom there. And just it's hard though. I felt a lot of pressure that I don't usually feel, especially when I saw that beautiful poster. I was stunned when I saw that. I was like, oh God, I've got to write a paper that does some honor to that. So hopefully that worked out. But it's a hard thing to do. And I think especially in these places where there is so much latent violence, ideological violence, that's also coupled with liberation. Right? There's a reason so many of us have stayed in the academy. And it's not only that we've been institutionalized, although that we have been to varying degrees, but this is also a place where we have been transformed, hopefully not disfigured. Or maybe there's a combination of the two. But my world is very, very different than it would have been if I had stayed in Victor. And my parents wanted me to go out, but they didn't want me to lose touch with where I came from. And that's been a struggle, and that's a struggle for a lot of us. But I think these places are important, they're vexed, they're complicated. It's that both and they're messy. And I think we were just talking about this, we have to do more to honor the messiness of who we are in all of our complexities and contradictions and in our professional existences. We are not only thinking beings, we are beings who have emotions and who have desires. And I'm still working to figure all that stuff out. I've been really blessed that I've had very supportive colleagues along the way, both at the institutions I'm in and in my discipline and in my fields. I've also been very blessed that I've had family who kept my feet on the ground and didn't let me get too uppity. And not that they were trying to shame me at all, but it's like they were reminding me. Sometimes my mom and I would have a debate, which my dad said we were arguing. And there would always be this moment where my mom would say, I'm not one of your goddamn students. because I could tell that I had shifted over to professor mode, and she didn't appreciate that. And that was always good, right? It was good to be reminded, and then we'd kind of bring the volume down, and we would have more of a respectful conversation. And I think that has also been really important to me. And, my folks passed away in the last few years, and that, I think, has been one of the most challenging things about their loss is I don't have somebody to run these big ideas by. Or like coming to Harvard was the first big life decision I ever made where I didn't consult my mom. And that was hard. It's still hard, right? And I know she would have been thrilled, but she would have also said, don't get too excited. Remember who you are. And that, I think if we're lucky, we have those people. And if we don't have those people, it's something to maybe try to build in. It makes these places better when that happens, I think. So I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Hi. At our whole little discussion group, we were super curious about the word Puritan rage, neo-Puritan rage, and it's not a word that I typically associate with the present Puritanism. And I was wondering if you could speak more about why you chose that word to describe our moment, and also more broadly, like where you're writing from today.
What was that last part?
Like where you're writing from today.
Oh, okay. I think we are in a very angry time. And, I used to be on Twitter. I was a much angrier person when I was. My husband was very happy when I left Twitter finally. And I'm joking about that, but I actually was like ill from the rage. So I think these neo-Puritans are very angry, and they don't really know what they're angry at. They've gone to all of the old standbys. It doesn't quite work like it used to, right? And partly it's the rage of impotence. Hopefully it stays impotent. But I think we are just in an incredibly angry time. And I think there is and it's not just neo-Puritans. I think a lot of people are angry out of frustration. The challenges are so big, and the unraveling is so comprehensive that it's very hard to approach it with anything but frustration. But I think what happens is we lose nuance, and our humanity is in the nuance. So when we're only reading through a lens of rage, we flatten everybody out into a caricature of who they are and who they can be. And most of my family is Republican. I don't want to lose them. Some of them I don't talk too much because it's not productive for us. But when my mom died, most of that family was there, and they held me up. And my very, very conservative uncle and his wife, and he describes himself as so conservative. How did he? Anyway, it doesn't matter. He's very conservative. But my husband and I went to their house for Thanksgiving. They were lovely. They sat with us as my mom died. I made sure that she had last rites. I wasn't in the room. I didn't want to be there for that, but I made sure for him, because he's Catholic, and another one of my aunts, that they had last rites. They had that moment with her. And it's not because, any of us are particularly virtuous or anything, but I think for us, what connected us, there were more things that connected us than divided us. And I think we spend a lot of time focusing on the things that don't. That's not to say that every relationship is healthy and is good to try to encourage. I also have a lot of people I've cut out, but I think the anger often doesn't go to places where we're building. it really goes to destroy. And any fool can destroy. It takes real work to create something. We live in a rageful time, but we also live in a very destructive time. And that, I think, again, people are thinking more about endings than what comes out of that ending. So I don't think I'm writing from a place of rage these days. I get pissed off all the time, but I do try to honor the teachings that have been shared with me, not just, by my family and not just in my nation, but by others, that there's hurt enough in this world. We don't need to add more if we can help it.
I disagree with you in some way of that, because I think anger can also be very productive. And in academia, I think a lot of anger is suppressed because it is not allowed, it is not permitted. One of the things I remember most about Christos is she was fierce.
Yeah.
Absolutely fierce, but in a wonderful way. It didn't shut you down. It didn't shut you out. It opened you to her world.
Yeah, I want to distinguish between rage and anger. So I am not in any way saying that we shouldn't be angry, and I'm not in any way pathologizing anger. I think anger can be incredibly generative, but I think rage is often attached to hate. And my mom had a saying, hate corrodes the vessel it's kept in. So my mom had two philosophies of life, and there's going to be some strong language here, but I think it's important. And this is kind of the person, the both and that my mom was. Her first philosophy was, sometimes it's better to be kind than right. That's not always easy to do, but it can go a long way in building and restoring relationships. Her other philosophy was, fuck them all, big and small, this ain't no Sunday picnic. The trick was knowing which one and when. If you got the wrong one, you had trouble. And I love that about her, right? Like she was a very kind person, but she could throw down. But I think anger is important. Anger can fuel you when nothing else does. But once it moves into hate, righteous anger is a beautiful thing. But hate never creates anything. But we need to distinguish between those two. So I appreciate it was important that I clarify that. So thank you. And Christos, absolutely, very, very righteously angry. And that's part of the importance of the work. Beth Brant was as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. To bring us back to what you were saying earlier with honoring the messiness, when you did have that moment where you realized that you weren't discussing sex in Indigiqueer texts, how did discussing sex and sexuality change not only your classroom discussions, but your relationship to the texts themselves?
Well, that's a really good question. So we didn't end up doing it that term. Like we were pretty much at the end of the semester, and I was like, oh, what do I do now? I can't just all of a sudden, start talking all about it. Like I need some time to deal with this. But since then, I'm still a little iffy about it. Partly because I'm a bit, I guess, vanilla in some ways, right? Like I'm a little old-fashioned in some ways, and that not to say that others shouldn't. And I'll actually give an example. So Joshua Whitehead emceed an erotic poetry event at one of our Native American and Indigenous Studies Association annual meetings. And he asked me to be one of the readers, which I was very flattered by. And I said, okay. And I told my husband, and my husband said, you? I was like, oh, that's not the right response. But so I was, but it was a good question because I didn't really have any erotic writing. And I go, and it's me and a bunch of young people. these young, brilliant, not just queer writers, but all Indigenous young people, who are just phenomenal. And in the front row are all of these aunties. And I'm like, oh no. I got really, all of that stuff kind of came back. And Joshua starts by reading the rimming scene from his novel, Johnny Appleseed. And I almost died. I'm like, oh no. And I just knew that these aunties were, I didn't know. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I was terrified. They loved it. They thought it was the most amazing thing. And then, we have these poets who are, doing all this amazing work. I really, just brilliant. And then I had to give my stuff. I'm like, one of these things is not like the other. It was such a beautiful moment, but I did realize, I'm probably not the person to do this. And since then, I've done like 3 erotic MC things. Like, I don't know why, but, it's fun. But it's, I think, also being true to the fact that I just get very flustered by those things. And it's not in any way judging the folks who are more comfortable with that. I'm pushing my boundaries a bit. It's fun, but I think part of my messiness is I'm always going to be a geek about that, right? Like I'm always going to be that weird like person who the minute somebody starts doing that, they go, like, and that's okay. That's part of the messiness too. So in class, I will talk about it, but I'll do it within what's comfortable for me. But I also make more space so students can talk about these things. I did have one experience in a class where I had a student who was quite homophobic. And he was really antagonistic the whole term. And we were reading Gregory Schofield's book of erotic poetry, Love, Medicine, and One Song. This was after that other incident. And he really did not like the fact that he had to read these poems because they're all erotic poems. And, most of them are around same-sex desire. And he was the first one who had to speak about his response to the book. And he said, I just thought it was disgusting. I felt like he was hitting on me the whole time I was reading it. And I said, well, this is a literature course. What passages specifically? Why don't you read them out? And he got quite flustered. And I said, well, no, if you're going to make that kind of statement, it's a literature course. It's literature. Let's talk about it. And he got very flustered and we waited and he started to read one of the poems and then we took it away from him so that he wasn't being shamed. But he also understood that, you're not going to come in here and bring your shaming dismissals. You're in a literature course. You're going to read it as literature. And we kept including him in the conversation. And he never got to where he liked me, but it was a shift in his participation that, I didn't care whether he liked the poetry or not. What was he going to learn from it? What were we going to learn together? And I think that was a place where we could talk about very sexually explicit stuff and not have it be in a way that was exploitative or extractive, but just like, this is part of life. Let's talk about it. But I think we have to work with our what works for us. And I will never be the person who does it without blushing. But I'll do it. I think we're at time.
We have time for one last question.
Thanks so much for this wonderful talk. I feel like suddenly now there's pressure on the last question. I wanted to ask about your learning of Cherokee, and you began with this wonderful introduction in Cherokee. And I was thinking as you spoke so much about beginnings and endings, if you could think about language with that and whether this feels like a beginning for you in some important way.
Yeah, well, I am not good at Cherokee. And I think that has been a hard thing. Partly I don't have anybody around, like in close proximity to speak it with. I've taken our beginning class 2 or 3 times. I have failed many quizzes, which is not great as a professor. But part of the exercise has also been, I'm the first, my great-grandfather spoke it fluently. My grandmother understood it. My dad heard it. I'm the first generation to never hear it in my family until I started taking classes. And part of the reason I did it was, for all the reasons of cultural connection, but also a lot of my students take language classes and they struggle a lot. And one thing in talking with some of my friends who teach language revitalization is it's typically Indigenous students who struggle the most, not because the language is harder for Indigenous students, but because the stakes are higher. So non-Indigenous people who take Indigenous languages classes typically often will do really well and often better than Indigenous students in the class because they don't have any stake in not getting it. But there's a lot of internalized shame. There's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of anguish. Like if it's your heritage language and you're struggling, what does that say about you? And I didn't quite get my student struggles until I started doing it. And it was excruciating. And even now, I don't practice enough. I struggle. I try especially in places like this to have the language spoken, because I think our languages need to be spoken in places like this, as well as everywhere else. And I've been really lucky that my teachers have not been shaming. There are language teachers who will shame people for not learning, but most of my teachers have been amazing. And, their philosophy is speak the language imperfectly. Just speak it in whatever context you can, in whatever way you can, out in the world, embody it, live it, let it live through you, and you're doing something good. One of my colleagues at UBC, Bernard Purley, talks about something. I just lost it. But other ways that the language exists other than fluency, that fluency doesn't have to be the only measure by which our languages are meaningful and exist in the world. Bernard Purley, look it up. I can't remember. It's late. But I think so for me, part of it was it's expanded my humility. It's also expanded my empathy with my students and my family members. And, and for a long time when I was writing about Indigenous literature, I was very certain when I would say Indigenous literatures in English are just as Indigenous as any other literature, even in our heritage tongues. And I think our literatures in English are also ours. But there are different worldings in our languages. There are different ways of understanding relationships. Cherokee is not a gendered language. It's a relational language. It's a verb-heavy language. It's not a noun-heavy language like English. That completely transforms what you're able to do with it and the way you understand relationships through it. That's partly also my struggle is I am so deeply embedded in English as a language, it's very hard to think outside of that. So I'll keep trying. I doubt I'll ever be anything even close to fluent, but I'll keep working at it. Thank you.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Justice. Thank you.
Thank you all.